How to actually switch to an artificial body, gradual remapping. One of the oldest transhumanist tropes is the idea of transferring your brain into a computer, thus achieving immortality and beyond human abilities, etc., etc. I am one of the people that believe this is actually possible, as in, not in the year 3000 people will be able to do this sort of way, but in the barring tremendous progress in accurate delivery of Okazaki factors, thymus transplants and various mTOR inhibitors and drugs that are marketed as something other than an mTOR inhibitor but are actually probably just a confounded mTOR inhibitor. Mind uploading will become my passion project once I hit my 30s. Why popular portrayals of the idea are impractical. Considering this, it sort of distresses me how popular culture portrays this. When I say popular culture here, I really mean every single thing I've ever read or seen of the subject, though chances are I might not be looking in the correct place. To give a few examples. A. Wikipedia's page on the subject, https://n.wikipedia.org/wiki/mind_uploading. B. Wikipedia's page on transhumanism in general, https://n.wikipedia.org/wiki/transhumanism. C. One of the most popular doomed venture/scams around this are, 2045 Initiative. http://2045.com/. D. One of the more realistic doomed venture/scams around this area, Netcom, https://nectomy.com/the case for glutaraldehyde structural encoding and preservation of long-term memories/. E. That one episode of Black Mirror that reminded everyone the Go-Go's were a thing and might have just been an inside joke about making a bunch of neckbeards watch a half-hour lesbian soap opera, https://www.youtube.com/watch. The equals 8 DNN31 TPOM 4. Basically, the ideas presented are as follows. 1. Using science fiction magic, we'll scan the brain, destroying it in the process, with a very high accuracy and upload its function to a computer that using science fiction to function exactly like a brain. 2. Using magic, we'll scan the brain, and leave it intact in the process, with a very high accuracy and upload its function to a computer using science fiction to function exactly like a brain. 3. Using science fiction, we'll build neurons or higher-level brain components, and using science fiction, we'll surgically replace the biological brain with these components. 4. Using science fiction, we'll keep the brain alive and well forever and make it control a robot body, also one of the stupidest ideas around, because keeping the brain alive and well forever outside of a human body is fundamentally harder than keeping it alive and well inside of a human body. When I say science fiction, I mean yes, this is theoretically not impossible as far as we understand the world, but it's in the realm of Dyson spheres, grey goo and digital picobots. We are a few hundreds generations of tooling away from even figuring out if we can do this and what the implications would be. When I say magic, I mean this pretty literally breaks the laws of physics/reality as agreed upon via strong experimental evidence. To the actual problem. I believe why most of the ideas here sound so far-fetched, at least to me, is not because the problem is fundamentally that hard, but because they refuse to tackle the actual question that is being begged here. What exactly are we trying to transfer and/or preserve? The short TL, doctor, is consciousness. The longer TL, doctor, might be something like 1. The feeling of attention and awareness plus the partial control I seem to have over them. 2. My mental map of the world and the ability to gradually update it. 3. Experience said mental map as the world and having it be shared by other creatures that I see as similar to myself. 4. The feeling of remembering things and the ability to somewhat accurately remember stuff. 5. The feeling that I exists, the feeling of self. The full picture is something like: I'm not exactly sure what I want to transfer and or preserve, but ideally, I'd like it to be similar to whatever is happening right now. Much the same way US judges can't define porn but can know it when they see it, we can't define consciousness but can know it when we are experiencing it, or being it. Rather. 3. A brief detour into non-dualism. Now, in order to even accept the idea of being able to transfer our brain or our consciousness or our feeling of self or our contiguous feeling of being a self we're agentic entity, we must be pretty sold on the idea of non-dualism. Basically accept the fact that our feeling of being us is simply the interaction of a bunch of processes going on in the brain and in the body. I think there's an infantile way to think about non-dualism, as perfectly illustrated in the Sam Harris book Free Will. The problem with this infantile way is that it basically boils down to the self is nothing or the self is everything. I don't think this view really holds sway, at least from a transhumanist perspective, partially because it seems unable to answer the fundamental question: why do you then even care if you live or die? Or even assuming nobody would be saddened by it, what's the argument against just killing yourself right now? I would claim some backing to this positions by looking at Buddhism, namely the fact that once it ended up defining enlightenment as kinda like being dead, it had to cram in the idea of, oh, but you can't just kill yourself, there's reincarnation, you see, achieving enlightenment is the only way to truly dying. A much better non-dualistic way of thinking about stuff is, in my opinion, closer to the kind of stuff Daniel Dennett talks about in this books, From Bacteria to Bark and Back, The Mind's Eye and Consciousness Explained. I truly recommend all of them, especially if you have a typical sciencey mentality. Daniel Dennett is basically too unique among modern philosopher of mind in that he seems to have a deep understanding of computers, machine learning, neuroscience, biology and the scientific method, so you don't end up reading him and feeling like his main hypothesis is based on him misunderstanding a simple phenomenon, or lacking information that's common knowledge in a specific research niche. I can't really do justice to his views in a few paragraphs, hence why I'm really trying to push people to read him, but it boils down to something like: yes, consciousness and the feeling of self are not inherent to the human brain and not inherent to biological machines. No, you don't need a ghost in the machine to have self or consciousness. Yes, the universe is, or at least could be, deterministic. That should change literally nothing about how we go about living life. No, just because there isn't a ghost in the machine and or the universe is deterministic, that doesn't mean that there is no self. The idea of self is as real as the idea of tree or car or human. Basically, the non-naive view of non-dualism accepts the fact that there's nothing special or magical about human brains, but also that the way we think of self relatively okay and the feeling of being ourselves or being conscious is about as real as anything else in the universe. For what we want to preserve might not be so large. So, what we want to preserve could be basically boiled down to the feeling of being an agentic self that experiences the world, has memory of its past activity, is able to create new memories and feels kinda human, feels and to some extent is similar to other humans. But, what I'm sure most people would agree we don't really need/want to preserve are things like, for example, the ability to control an exact replica of our body, kinda pointless if you want a new one. The unconscious processes that make us randomly wake up at night when we hear a random sound. Apologies to any reader still living in a primeval hunter-gatherer tribe where hearing a loud noise at night might actually mean a predator or another human is trying to sneak up on you and kill you. Indeed, I think once you boil it down to some thoughts experiments, people are able to give up on even more ground. Let me get out some ideas/examples to back this up. We can probably be us without various parts of the brain. The brainstem seems to be in large part associated with transmitting and receiving information from the peripheral nervous system. This includes what we'd call the automatic nervous system. Generally speaking, we have little control and awareness of it, most people can't consciously control their liver enzyme production, and the somatic nervous system, which is critical for that feeling of agency mentioned below. It basically gives us the ability to feel/control our body. That being said, paraplegics can lose control and awareness of most of the somatic nervous system, and they still seem to be selves. They are as conscious as us. Now, you can't really remove this in a normal human, because their bodies would die, but it is arguably not a critical part of consciousness. Many areas of the cerebral cortex aren't essential to life. Damaging/removing them will only destroy the function associated with that area, for example visual cortex in the occipital lobe, auditory cortex in the temporal lobe, etc. These experiments are mainly done in animals, rarely done nowadays, and the only human examples are stroke patients where the removal is usually not very clean, though they still seem to be consciousness. Some references discussing removal/damage/role for the auditory and visual cortex which I find interesting, and largely supportive of this view. https://www.urosci.org/content/33/48/18740 https://www.npd.nlm.nih gov/pussy/articles/pussy 3689329/https://www.npd.nlm.nih gov/pussy/articles/pussy 3476047/ A corpus callosotomy mostly separates the two hemispheres of the brain. Experimental evidence seems to indicate that these hemispheres are not able to communicate, see example. Both are able to hear and perform actions with their respective side of the body, but subjects seem to only be aware of one of the hemispheres. I think there's an argument to be made, based on the feelings that these patients describe and their actions, that they are conscious of only a single hemisphere. It could be argued that the other hemisphere is also conscious but unable to communicate. So, assuming that you are awake during the surgery, people are awakened during it but are kept under for the splitting the skull open and closing it shut bits, would this change of conscious experience be analogous to death or so undesirable as to prefer death to it? Based on the fact that these people lead overall happy life, I'd assume the answer is no. You can go even further with this and look at a total hemispherectomy. Read, one hemisphere is removed, but due to the sheer amount of damage done to the brain, recovery is usually less than ideal. Still, patients that do recover seem pretty conscious. Your brain can be pretty tiny and you can be conscious. Granted, there's few examples to go by here, but that can be partially because we don't really notice brain shrinkage in many cases if it's gradual or a defect from birth. Assuming the neurosurgeons reporting this aren't lying to get in a publication though, you can get to pretty severe levels of shrinkage. https://scihub.tw/https://d.o.i .org/10.1016/S0140673600761,127 and still maintain an IQ of 75 and not consider yourself a philosophical zombie. So, now ask yourself. Is a hypothetical paraplegic, 1, patient with more than half of his brain mass removed, 4, and another half of his brain mass removed from consciousness, 3, with potentially even more brain mass removal from the cerebral cortexes, 2, arguably still be conscious, still be a self? A non-ideal way to live. But, still a life and not so bad if the advances of science could bring you back to full speed in a few dozens of years. Now, this is obviously a pretty big if, but under this optimistic model a conscious human-like brain could simply be very simplified version of the brainstem to gather and integrate sensations. 1/4 frontal lobe to do most of what we regard as conscious thinking. Note, the frontal lobe includes most of the areas we associate with things like language. Some analogous for the mammillary bodies, hippocampus, amygdala and corpus striatum to store and bring back memories. Some version of at least some of the cerebral cortexes that receive, interpret and think about sensations. A few extra bits and pieces that aren't significant in terms of computations as far as the brain goes but might in some way be critical to the feeling of self. Please assume this is an oversimplified idea of the human brain, an overly optimistic example and is not fully factually correct. That's what I'm assuming. My main point here isn't to describe creating a human brain, my main point here is to say, it seems intuitive that we don't need all of it to be conscious to experience being a self. The gradual transfer. So, assuming that consciousness is not magic and we can basically tell if we are conscious and how conscious we are, think the state between sleeping and awake for a picture of how you can be conscious but not fully so. The brain is no magic and can be partially distilled into components with separate roles. The brain doesn't fulfill all its roles optimally and certain roles, for example autonomous control, are not at all required for having a conscious experience. Our advancement in hardware, software and understanding of neuroscience and neurosurgery won't experience a singularity, they'll advance slowly but steadily as they have done for the last 50 years. How could we realistically try to transfer I into something that is not our body? I think the answer boils down to gradually. Gradual transfer would essentially be step-by-step transfer of brain functionality onto peripheral device, giving said device more and more computing power and responsibility, allowing them to communicate with each other and hoping that over time you can basically transfer the sensation of I to said device. Let me give a few examples of where we are currently at in terms of such peripheral device, not designs that exist on paper, devices that exist today, that are being used by humans, that can be bought by you, in some cases only with a doctor's approval though. A. Using the somatic nerves in part of your tongue to see. Now, I'm not sure if any sighted person tried a device like BrainPort, but judging by the testimonies of people born with sight, it seems to work pretty much like seeing, just with a very low resolution. B. BCI-controlled robotic arms. This requires a pretty safe direct implants on the surface of the motor cortex. And in case you were wondering, it's also been recently done to some extent with non-invasive sensors, sitting on top of your skin. Note, this includes feeling the actual arm. C. Using computers for language processing and mathematics. This is something we all do, to some extent. Ever used a speed reader? Congrats, you just outsourced/modified a big part of how your brain read language. Ever had some complex arithmetics to compute and pulled out a Python shell or a phone? Yep, outsourcing your ability to do math. Well, I'd argue that this is basically the area we should be focused on if we care about consciousness/self-transfer. For example, think about robotic arms controlled via RL training, where you can give even more complex tasks like pick up that object. Given the previously shown robotic arm, I see no reason we couldn't control one where we just have to think about the movement and then have the arm do it, for example via electrodes connected to the prefrontal cortex. If you look at various DIY hacks using non-invasive BCIs, I think this enters the realm of relatively trivial if you spent enough time training your brain and could afford spending a few hundreds of thousands on a robotic arm to play around. Here are 4 examples. I think a similar thing could arguably be feasible for arithmetic, where we basically attach the calculator to the prefrontal cortex, or our temporal lobe. Or attaching a page scanning plus summary making device, say, using a simple camera, and a fancy attention network, close to one of our language processing centers and teaching ourselves to read a book diagonally using it, then decide if we want to go more in depth and continue reading it normally, or using a second speed reader peripheral. Okay, in saying attach some electrodes to the front lobe I might seem to be doing a lot of hand waving, basically invoking the good old once science progresses enough this will be trivial. But, I will point you back to examples A and B, the electrode-controlled arm and the tongue-perceived camera. These seem basically just as hand-wavy. The location they were placed in was not selected by optimizing for specific neural pathways, it was selected due to ease of access. The brain literally learns how to interpret the data coming to and from this and maps them in the correct locations. The science behind how that happens is basically hand-wavy, since we don't really know on a deep level, but that's not bad, that's amazing. We can skip one of the hardest steps of making a brain, understanding how it works on a deep level, because the brain itself is able to adapt, it's able to map functionality onto different parts of itself, the nervous system and external devices. This has been known for quite a while, in that the brain can map and remap different functions onto different parts of itself. The real question is how much can we learn to map onto more complex peripheral devices? What seems to be lacking in current devices is a thing that we closely associate with consciousness, namely introspection and memory access and storage. Memory accessing/storage hasn't been tested in humans partially due to physical limitations, as in, the parts related to memory are literally deep inside our brain, and reaching them with electrodes is very dangerous. But, in principle, we can reconstruct images from a brain fMRI. fMRI resolution is a topic I'm not qualified to speak on. After digging into the subject for a previous project, it seems like it's an area with plenty of S. Suffice to say, best resolutions you will find outside of labs might be something like 500 micrometers with a frequency of 10 Hz, to be generous. Based on what I've found, reference 1, reference 2, it seems like this could improve, but there's a hard limit at the hundreds or a few dozens of microns. No frequency information, let's assume 100 Hz. The image reconstruction study used 2000 micrometers, that is 2000 micrometers caret 3, and doesn't specify the frequency, maybe no that relevant. With electrode arrays, the technology I'm mainly harping on about here, it seems that practical sizes go down to 10 micrometers per electrode, after that filtering noise is too hard for now. But, suffice to say, I think if we can accurately reconstruct an image from an fMRI, it's within the realm of possible right now to reconstruct or read a memory with sufficient electrodes. This argument is kinda far-fetched. However, considering people are studying this very thing in vivo and getting results, I'd say that it's not in the realm of science fiction, closer to 10 years give or take 5. To recapitulate, we can connect peripheral devices via electrodes to the autonomous nervous system, scalp and surface portions of the brain. Said devices can be controlled and in the first and last case felt using our brain. In principle, I think there's an argument this could be done with more of the brain's functionality, but right now there's not much of an argument for doing so. Invasive surgery that requires drilling a small hole through the skull is not warranted for doing math better or reading faster. I also believe there's an argument that nothing stops this sort of electrode mapping from accessing anatomically harder to reach, other than, again, high risk and low reward. Peripheral devices that fulfill some functions we normally achieve in our brain exist, for example eye tracking cameras, RL-trained robotic arms that can follow NL instructions, reading devices that can give a summary of the text at various resolutions or extract keywords. But to my knowledge only simplistic version, for example in the case of robotic arms extrapolating complex movements from simple signals, have been attached to the human brains directly, partially because the objective here was to safely and quickly treat an existing ailment, not gradual transfer. We don't have to be very exact when mapping brain function to a peripheral device connected to the nervous system, the brain can learn to do the remapping. Microelectrode array used for in vitro testing. Just though the photo looked cool, not that relevant to in vivo arrays. Okay, here comes the hand-waving bit. So, assuming you can outsource a bunch of brain functionality to peripheral devices, you'd still have the issues of A. Those things not being conscious on their own, without the brain. B. The brain being speckled with electrode arrays, we can have a few implanted relatively safely. Once you go down to 100s, simple things like infections might become an issue. There's too many points of failure. Implanting through a single hole is doable, but then wire size and getting the electrodes in the correct place becomes an issue. So how do you fix this? Well, you don't map many peripherals to the brain at once. You map a few peripherals via electrode arrays implanted in specific places that allow for generic communication, for example thalamus, various areas on the frontal cortex and various areas in the visual and motor cortex. Then, you let the brain transfer functionality to the peripherals. Impose rules on yourself such as I will never do mental math again outside of my math-specific circuit, or I will always try to interact with objects based on what my image interpretation circuit tells me, only resorting to actual vision in critical situations. As more functionality is being transferred, you don't increase the bandwidth, you instead increase the complexity of the peripherals. Take the simple arithmetic peripheral for example. Instead of adding different discrete functions to it, you could try to map all the math functionality of your brain into it. So suddenly, you're not giving it numbers anymore, you're giving it an image of an urn, 5 balls extracted from the urn, 3 blue, 2 black, and it tells you probability of 2/5 that the next ball is black. Or, take the object recognition peripheral. Instead of having it pipe labels or formed images to the brain, you make it classify them and pipe them to the appropriate circuit. For example, this is an image of an equation, I shall send this to the math peripheral, or, this is an image of something I could stumble on, I shall send this to the motion controlling peripheral. Peripheral communication can be increased with little cost. Building on point 1, the throughput to and from the brain might be limited, but throughput between peripherals doesn't need to be. You can have the vision and math peripherals interact, such that one sees an equation, the other one solves or extract insights, and when someone asks you what's the solution of that equation, or how would you simplify that, you can simply query the math peripheral directly, and, provided no answer, you can tell the vision peripheral to send the equation to it, and, provided no answer, you can start doing higher levels tasks like looking at it with your own eyes. Introspection, the big thing that is missing here is introspection, which seems to be pretty relevant for the overall concept of consciousness. So how do you go about doing that? Well, in 2 ways. A. You build peripherals specifically dedicated to understanding the other peripherals. Whenever you have a question about how does this or that work, or why is this or that giving an error, you try to phrase that as a mental question for the evaluation peripheral, which then in turn analyzes the others and sends you back an answer. B. You build a debugging interface in the peripherals, which would likely be more computationally complex than the peripherals themselves, but doable. Think of a complex network for tracking, classifying and creating bounding boxes for objects. This is partially split into functions, such that you can try and add a secondary debugging algorithm on top, an algorithm that you can query to ask things like roughly why did you classify this as y? Or around what point did you decide area x did not contain a relevant object? And get answers like because this and this rough shape that come up when I apply the convolution operation strongly remind me of a y, or because the color in area x is pretty homogeneous and I see now shadows. If these seem like pretty complex questions to ask of a neural network, that's because they are. There's some research in the area of network analyses, for example reference 1, reference 2, but it's mostly focused on trying to understand the internal equation in order to optimize it or to spot the values and times during training which lead to errors. There's not field of analyzing neural network to interpret them in a human brain compatible way, or of building neural network that are more human brain compatible in the way that they operate. But conceptually, such interpretations are possible. See for example deep dream style projects, which are simply extracting information from the first few layers of a network that's feed noise. You can recognize dog-like and cat-like things in them, because the networks were trained on such images. From those sort of patterns it's pretty easy to generalize to because it reminded me of this specific shape which I associate with dogs. You hope that your consciousness sort of starts mapping onto this peripherals. Again, assuming that senses, memory, feeling of location in space, agentic decision-making, ability to read things, ability to map things into words and pronounce them and such functions basically accumulate to the conscious experience that I class I. What we'd be pretty much doing here, by outsourcing functionality to peripherals and letting them handle more and more complex tasks, introspect about themselves, store things in a long-term memory and dictate, record and think about the behavior of other peripherals, is more or less gradually letting them do the things that we associate with I. So provided enough space for computation, and again, these are standard computer you can connect to a power source or put in a car, we can have plenty of computing power here. Might the feeling of I transfer to these complex circuits external to my body that do part of my thinking, memorization and sensory perception for me, and if this is true, we could progress by transferring more and more of the things that we hold to be important about ourselves onto the peripherals. Essentially moving I onto the peripherals and leaving the brain as a redundant storage for some of the information, double checker for the decisions of the peripherals and storage for information that we considered irrelevant, but might decide we care about in the future. 7. In conclusion, the more I write about this, the more I realize it's hard to paint a good picture of this view of consciousness transfer. In that I am not very certain of my knowledge around the subject, and thus how possible it is, double-checking that knowledge is time-consuming and trying to make it make sense in under 5,000 words is even more difficult. I think it's very reasonable to say that this view of gradually giving up brain functions to peripherals, and tweaking said peripherals until we understand them until they become part of us is a much more realistic view, given current and near-future technology, than other proposed idea for consciousness transfer. It sounds a bit more strange and convoluted, but that is exactly because it's achievable. A Dyson sphere is much easier to explain than a plane, but that's not because it's easier building a Dyson spheres than building planes, it's exactly because building a plane is something we can do, so we can't just skim of irrelevant details because we realize they are important. We can just wave and say superheat-resistant carbon nanotubes and super-fast absorption solar panel and insert SF technology, and we have a Dyson sphere. But get 0.x% of the alloy composition for the wings of a Boeing 700 wrong and suddenly it's no a plane anymore. Scanning a human brain and uploading it to a computer might seem a bit more intuitive than gradually releasing control to external devices and hoping that they gain consciousness which we consider to be part of ourselves, but that because in the former scenario we use the hand-wavy idea of scan a human brain. But scanning a brain is not currently possible, it's so far away you can't even name the chain of technologies required to make it possible. Furthermore, assuming that scanning a brain through magic, and transferring it to a computer through magic, and assuming that said computer then feels like I because magic is an improbable achievement. With the gradual transfer method we actually have the amazing option of stopping, if it doesn't seem to work. If the thing we are transferring to doesn't feel like I or like consciousness, then we can tweak it, we can change our approach or we can give up and not be dead. Is the idea that I presented here possible with current technology, or technology that will be available in 5 to 10 years, for example 4 nanometers transistors? I don't know, I do know that it doesn't seem that far-fetched and most of the components needed are already there, there's no need for exponential improvement. Linear improvement will do. Plus, the most complex part of the idea, the remapping of function, is left to the most intelligent and well-suited entity in the system, the brain itself. It is also more plausible in that the remapping doesn't have to be instant, like a scan plus transfer, you could well take 30 to 40 years to remap your brain, adding little bits at a time, so by the time your body is failing you can just decouple from it. You can be you as a consciousness that feel contiguous just in a different artificial body, running on different circuitry. We are basically switching from reading a few exabytes of data in seconds, to allowing said exabytes of data to move themselves over dozens of years, and allowing pruning of irrelevant information, for example ability to control the old body. Finally, my goal here is not to claim this is the definitive strategy and the perfect description of it, but rather, to say that this seems like a better direction to focus attention towards than the quack brain scan ideas. It's still well in the realm of transhumanist quackery, but you could actually design experiments and devices to accomplish this, at least to get part of the way there.